She was born Alexandra Zuck on April 23, 1942, in Bayonne, New Jersey, a tiny girl who would one day become one of Hollywood's most beloved faces. But long before the bright lights and movie premieres, there was pain, quiet, hidden, and far too heavy for a child to bear. Her parents divorced when she was very young, leaving her mother, Mary, to raise her alone. When Mary remarried a man named Eugene Jean Duvin, Sandra's life took a dark and irreversible turn. Behind the closed doors of their home, the man who was supposed to be a father figure reportedly abused her, a secret she carried in silence for decades. The trauma shaped her world from that moment on. It planted seeds of insecurity, of distrust, of a desperate need to please others, things that would follow her into every relationship and every role she played. To the outside world, though, young Sandra was radiant, beautiful, poised, and destined for greatness. By the time most girls her age were still in school, she was already working as a model to help support herself and her mother. Her delicate features and soft grace made her a favorite among photographers, and soon her face began to appear in ads and magazines. Hollywood took notice. It wasn't long before Universal Studios came calling, seeing in her a blank canvas, a young woman they could mold into the perfect image of purity and youth. Her transition into acting happened quickly. In 1957, she made her film debut, and by 1959, she was everywhere. That year alone, she starred in Imitation of Life, Gidget, and Summer Place, 3 films that would cement her status as America's sweetheart. Audiences adored her. She represented everything clean and hopeful, a symbol of the innocence that America wanted to believe still existed. Studio executives leaned into that image, carefully crafting her roles and public persona to protect the illusion. She was a sweet girl next door, the embodiment of virtue, a character she could play perfectly on screen, even as her real life was filled with fear and self-doubt. But that illusion came at a cost. Beneath the perfection, Sandra was a young woman struggling to stay in control of a body and a life that never felt truly her own. The modeling world had already taught her to obsess over her appearance, and the constant pressure to maintain her image pushed her toward extreme dieting and self-criticism. What began as discipline became obsession. She fought silently against anorexia long before the world even had a word for it. Every camera flash, every smile on set, was another mask, one more attempt to hide the pain that no one was allowed to see. In public, she was adored. In private, she was lost. The studios, her mother, and her fans all wanted Sandra Dee, the perfect movie star. But Alexandra Zuck, the real girl beneath the name, was still just trying to survive. And as her fame grew, the gap between who she was and who she had to be would only widen, setting the stage for the heartbreaks yet to come. When Sandra Dee met Bobby Darin, it was as if 2 different worlds collided. One made of soft edges and innocence, the other a sharp ambition and restless charm. The year was 1960, and they were filming come September in Italy. Sandra was already a star, Hollywood's good girl, while Bobby was a rising singer with a swagger that seemed to fill every room. To many, he was cocky, brash, and determined. To Sandra, he was everything she wasn't. At first, she resisted him. His confidence felt like arrogance, his boldness unsettling. She'd grown up guarded, careful, always taught to keep her emotions under tight control. Bobby, on the other hand, lived like a man running out of time, because deep down he was his heart condition, the result of a childhood illness, meant he never expected to live a long life, and that urgency drove everything he did, especially when it came to love. He made no secret of his interest in Sandra. Castmates later recalled how he openly pursued her, even going so far as to charm her mother, Mary, in an effort to win her approval. The gesture worked, perhaps too well. Mary adored Bobby's energy and confidence, believing he would protect her daughter from the darker side of Hollywood. But Sandra remained hesitant. She'd grown up with little trust in men, and Bobby's relentless pursuit only made her more cautious. Then came a fateful day, a simple carriage ride that changed everything. During that quiet moment together, away from cameras and chaperones, Bobby dropped his showmanship. He spoke softly, vulnerably, and for the first time, Sandra saw not the confident performer but the man beneath, someone who longed for love and security as much as she did. By the time the film wrapped, her resistance had melted into something tender. On December 1st, 1960, without fanfare or Hollywood spectacle, they eloped. She was just 18. At first, their marriage seemed like a dream. The press couldn't get enough of them. The perfect couple of young Hollywood, all smiles and soft glances. They looked radiant together. He, the sharp entertainer. She, the angelic movie star. In December 1961, their son Dodd was born, sealing the image of the perfect family. Together, they worked on films like If a Man Answers, 1962, and That Funny Feeling, 1965, where their on-screen chemistry mirrored what audiences believed was their real-life devotion. But behind the public image, things weren't nearly as perfect. Bobby's health issues loomed over them both like a silent storm. He knew his time might be short, and that fear fueled his obsession with success. Every performance, every project, had to count. He demanded everything from himself, and, at times, from Sandra, too. He wanted her by his side always, following him on tours, traveling wherever he went. But the glamour of the stage lights couldn't fill the loneliness of hotel rooms or the ache of constant separations. Sandra, still so young, struggled to find her footing as a wife and new mother while living in the shadow of a man who was both brilliant and unpredictable. She adored him, but also feared losing herself in his world. He, in turn, adored her but couldn't escape the jealousy that came from knowing how much the world adored her too. To the outside world, they were a picture of golden perfection, the darlings of their generation. But in private, the cracks had already begun to show. Beneath the love and laughter lay two fragile souls, one fighting time, the other fighting fear, bound together by passion, but slowly being undone by the weight of what neither of them could say out loud. By the early 1960s, the fairy tale was starting to crumble. Behind the photographs of Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin smiling arm in arm, there were long silences, sharp words, and quiet tears. Sandra's insecurities, born from a childhood of instability and control, were beginning to show through the perfect facade. Her mother, Mary, still hovered over every decision, from what role she should take to how she should behave in public. For years, Sandra had lived under her mother's dominance, first as a frightened child, then as a star who was never allowed to grow into her own woman. Now, as a wife and mother herself, she found it difficult to separate who she was from who others wanted her to be. Her marriage to Bobby was meant to be her escape, but instead, it became another space filled with pressure. She adored him, perhaps too much. Having already experienced abandonment, she clung to him with a kind of desperate devotion. Every moment of distance felt like rejection. Every quiet day on the road while he performed was a wound. The more he focused on his music, the more she turned inward, nursing old fears that she wasn't enough. Those fears became habits. Sandra began to drink, often just to quiet the anxiety that seemed to hum beneath her skin. Gambling gave her a rush, a fleeting sense of control in a life where she'd never had much. And sometimes she'd stir conflict or drama just to feel Bobby's attention again, even if it came through anger. But Bobby wasn't an easy man to love. Those close to him often said he could turn you off like a light switch. One moment, he'd be charming and affectionate, making Sandra laugh until she forgot her worries. The next, he would draw completely, cold and unreachable. His ambition ruled his life. He was constantly chasing the next hit, the next opportunity, and that drive left little space for emotional stability at home. He expected Sandra to understand, but her sensitivity only made his distance more painful. And then came the jealousy. Sandra was young, stunning, and constantly surrounded by men, co-stars, directors, photographers. To Bobby, whose own confidence often masked deep insecurity, that attention became unbearable. When she tried to assert herself socially, to step out of his shadow, it only made him suspicious. He couldn't shake the fear that she might one day turn her attention elsewhere. Around 1963, that fear seemed to take shape. Sandra was filming Tammy and the doctor opposite Peter Fonda. On set, she found Fonda easy to talk to, friendly, understanding, and nothing like Bobby's fiery temperament. Rumors started to swirl that their on-screen chemistry had crossed into real life. To this day, no evidence has ever proven there was an affair. But for Bobby, truth didn't matter. Suspicion was enough. Convinced she had been unfaithful, he reportedly refused to confront her directly. Instead, he had someone else, one of his associates, call Sandra to tell her he wanted a divorce. Sandra was blindsided. She denied everything, insisting that Peter Fonda had been nothing more than a kind co-worker. She begged Bobby to speak with her face-to-face, to believe her, to give her a chance to explain. For weeks, their marriage hung by a thread. Friends intervened, and slowly, through a mix of love, exhaustion, and denial, they found their way back to each other. By the end of 1963, the couple had reconciled, at least publicly. They attended events together, posed for photos, smiled for reporters. But something fundamental had changed. The trust that once bound them was fractured. Bobby's jealousy never truly faded, and Sandra's anxiety only deepened. Their love, once bright and youthful, was now shadowed by suspicion. They had survived one separation, but the wounds left behind were only beginning to fester. By 1966, the golden sheen of Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin's marriage had worn thin. The smiles they showed the public no longer reflected the tension simmering behind closed doors. What began as a love story that captivated Hollywood had slowly eroded into suspicion, silence, and heartbreak. Years of insecurity, jealousy, and miscommunication had left both of them raw. Bobby's distrust had become a living thing, shadowing their every interaction. Sandra, fragile and worn down, was trying to hold together a home that already felt broken. It was during this period that a seemingly harmless encounter changed everything. At a buffet hosted by Joan Collins and Anthony Newley, Sandra struck up a casual conversation with actor Warren Beatty. Beatty was famously charming, magnetic, quick-witted, and notoriously flirtatious. To anyone else, it was an ordinary Hollywood exchange. A few minutes of polite conversation in a crowded room. But to Bobby, who was already consumed by doubt, it was confirmation of his worst fears. He wasn't there to witness anything inappropriate. He didn't need to. The idea was enough to send him spiraling. Instead of confronting Sandra directly, Bobby chose a strange, almost cruel way to communicate his decision. Rather than face her himself, he allegedly had her psychiatrist deliver the message that he wanted a divorce. It was cold, impersonal, and devastating. Sandra, blindsided and confused, could hardly believe that the man she had once adored, the man she had built her world around, would end things through a third party. She tried reaching out to him, desperate to understand, to talk, to fix whatever had gone wrong. But Bobby shut her out completely. The trust between them, already cracked from past suspicions, shattered beyond repair. There were no fights, no cathartic confessions, just silence. Darin refused to discuss his feelings openly, and Sandra was left drowning in uncertainty. She denied any affair, insisting that her interaction with Beatty had been nothing more than polite conversation. But the damage was done. Bobby's jealousy had metastasized into something far more toxic. Every friendship, every professional engagement, every casual conversation she had with another man became a potential betrayal in his eyes. For Sandra, it was unbearable. The woman who had once been the nation's symbol of light and innocence now felt trapped in darkness. Her husband's lack of trust cut deeper than any public criticism ever could. She began to withdraw, emotionally, socially, spiritually. The pressure to try to prove her innocence while watching her marriage disintegrate pushed her further into isolation. The drinking became heavier. The quiet, self-destructive habits she had developed years before now became her only form of escape. By the end of 1967, the marriage was beyond saving. The pair had grown too far apart, separated by pride, pain, and the ghosts of misunderstandings that had never been resolved. Their divorce was finalized that December, officially ending what had once been Hollywood's picture-perfect romance. For Sandra, the fallout was catastrophic. Universal, the studio that had built her image and career, dropped her soon after. Her fame, once radiant and effortless, began to fade. She was only in her mid-20s, but she had already lived through the dizzying highs of stardom and the crushing lows of scandal and loss. The affair that supposedly ended her marriage wasn't an affair at all, not in the literal sense. It was the story of a woman destroyed by mistrust and a man consumed by his own fears. The love that had once defined them both had turned into the very thing that broke them. And when it was finally over, Sandra was left standing in the wreckage, her marriage gone, her career in decline, and her heart scarred in ways the world would never truly see. In the years following her divorce from Bobby Darin, Sandra Dee's life unraveled in slow, painful motion. The fairy tale image that had once defined her became impossible to sustain. Gone were the magazine covers, the studio contracts, the glowing interviews about young love. What remained was a woman battling her own ghosts, the ones that had always been there, now left unchecked and louder than ever. Sandra's descent began quietly. The public saw only glimpses, missed appearances, canceled projects, fading publicity shots. But behind closed doors, she was falling apart. The trauma of her childhood had never been addressed. Her marriage had merely buried it beneath glamour and routine. Now, without Bobby or a career to occupy her, those buried wounds resurfaced with devastating force. Alcohol became a crutch, a way to numb the pain of loneliness and self-doubt. Her struggle with anorexia, which had begun in her teenage modeling years, worsened as she tried to control the only thing she could, her body. Friends describe her as reclusive, hesitant to trust, and often detached from reality. Her mother, Mary Duvin, remained a constant presence, but not a comforting one. Their relationship, always strained and complex, became increasingly toxic. Mary had controlled much of Sandra's early life, and even in adulthood, Sandra couldn't fully break free. The two shared a deep codependence marked by guilt, resentment, and a kind of love that hurt as much as it healed. The world might have seen a glamorous starlet, but at home, she was a woman trapped between her past and her pain. Bobby Darin, meanwhile, was fighting his own battles. His health, fragile since childhood due to a rheumatic heart condition, had begun to deteriorate rapidly. After the divorce, he threw himself into his work, recording new music and performing live with the same energy that had once captivated Sandra. But the drive that fueled his career came with a price. He pushed his body beyond its limits, refusing to slow down even as doctors warned him to rest. In 1973, at just 37 years old, Bobby Darin died following open-heart surgery. For Sandra, his death was a devastating blow. Though their marriage had long since ended, the bond between them had never completely disappeared. In private, she mourned not only the man he was, but the life they had shared and lost. Friends said that his passing reopened wounds she had never truly healed from. She never got over Bobby, their son Dodd would later say. She never stopped loving him. Dodd Darin grew up in the shadow of his parents' turbulent love story. In his 1994 book, Dream Lovers, The Magnificent Shattered Lives of Bobby Darin and Sandra Dee, he painted a portrait of two people who were, at their core, broken long before they met each other. He didn't portray his parents as villains or victims, but as human, flawed, wounded, and desperate for love. His words capture the tragedy of their union. Two souls trying to heal through each other, but only managing to deepen the fractures within themselves. As the years passed, Sandra's health continued to decline. Decades of emotional distress and substance abuse took their toll, and she withdrew almost completely from public life. By the late 1990s, she was battling kidney disease and other health complications. Yet even as her body weakened, the world still remembered her as that luminous young woman on screen, the smiling blonde in Gidget or the tender daughter in Imitation of Life. The contrast between who she had been and who she became was heartbreaking. Sandra Dee passed away on February 20th, 2005, at the age of 62. Her death marked the quiet end of a life that had once been lived so loudly under Hollywood's spotlight. She left behind a complicated legacy, a reminder of the price of fame and the toll of silence. To millions, she would always be the sweet, innocent face of a golden era. But behind that facade was a woman who suffered deeply, who loved fiercely, and who never fully escaped the pain that shaped her. In the end, Sandra's story and her doomed marriage to Bobby Darin wasn't about scandal or betrayal. It was about fragility, survival, and the human cost of trying to live up to a perfect image. What destroyed their marriage wasn't a single affair, but the accumulation of fear, jealousy, and emotional wounds neither of them knew how to heal. And though both are gone, their story remains one of Hollywood's most haunting love tragedies. Not because of its fame, but because of its truth. When people look back at the story of Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin, it's tempting to search for a single moment, one fight, one mistake, one supposed affair, that shattered their marriage. But the truth is far more complex and infinitely more human. What destroyed them wasn't a single act of betrayal. It was years of silence, insecurity, and pain that neither of them ever truly knew how to face. Their love story was a tragedy, not a scandal, but of miscommunication and emotional wounds too deep for either to heal. The first crack began long before Bobby Darin entered Sandra Dee's life. Her early trauma, the sexual abuse she endured at the hands of her stepfather, and the culture of silence that followed, left her scarred in ways invisible to the public. She was taught to suppress, to smile, to move on. That habit of silence carried into adulthood and into her marriage. When she felt hurt, she withdrew. When she was afraid, she smiled. And when Bobby's jealousy grew, she lacked the emotional tools to confront it directly. Their home became a place of unspoken words and unresolved tension, a quiet battlefield where love and resentment lived side by side. Bobby, for his part, was haunted by his own fears. His lifelong heart condition had taught him from an early age that time was running out, that he had to achieve everything quickly, live fiercely, love urgently. That urgency made him ambitious, but it also made him controlling. He wanted stability, a wife who would be there, waiting, safe from temptation. When Sandra spoke to other men or showed independence, his jealousy flared. What began as protectiveness grew into paranoia. Even the smallest gesture, a laugh, a look, a friendly conversation, became proof in his mind that she might betray him. Jealousy is, in many ways, a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more Darin distrusted her, the more distance he created. The more he accused, the more she withdrew. His inability to confront her directly, relying instead on friends, messages, even a psychiatrist to deliver his feelings, turned misunderstandings into permanent damage. Communication broke down entirely. The silence between them became deafening, and once that wall was built, neither could tear it down. Sandra, meanwhile, was facing an identity crisis that few could see. Her entire life had been constructed around an image, America's sweetheart, the wholesome, pure ingenue. That persona wasn't just a role. It was her entire sense of worth. When her marriage began to crumble and her career faltered, she didn't know who she was anymore. She had been shaped by others. First her mother, then the studios, then Bobby. Without them, she felt lost. Emotional dependency had defined her relationships, and without that anchor, she drifted into despair. The power imbalance between her and Bobby was subtle but constant. He was older, more experienced, and fiercely ambitious. She, though talented and beloved, had been conditioned to please, to defer, to follow. When conflict arose, it was rarely an equal fight. Bobby's voice carried authority, while Sandra's was often drowned out by certainty. She loved him deeply, but she also lived in his shadow, struggling to find her own footing. And so, despite all the gossip and speculation, there was never one affair that destroyed their marriage. The rumors about Peter Fonda and Warren Beatty were just surface ripples of deeper emotional turmoil. The real story wasn't about infidelity. It was about trust lost long before it could ever be betrayed. It was about two people who loved each other intensely, but were trapped inside their own unresolved pain. Sandra's trauma made her retreat from confrontation. Bobby's insecurity made him chase control. Together, they formed a cycle of misunderstanding that neither could break. Their marriage became a mirror reflecting their deepest fears. For Sandra, the fear of being unloved. For Bobby, the fear of losing everything, health, time, and love itself. In the end, their downfall wasn't sensational. It was heartbreakingly ordinary. It was what happens when love meets unhealed wounds, when silence replaces honesty, and when fear eclipses trust. The affair that supposedly destroyed Sandra Dee's marriage never truly existed. But the emotional chasm that opened between them was real, vast, and fatal. What remained was not hatred, but sorrow, the quiet sadness of two people who might have saved each other, if only they had known how to speak. It's impossible to tell the story of Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin, without wondering what if. Their love, so dazzling at first, was built on fragile ground, a union between two people who wanted to be saved but didn't know how to rescue themselves. Looking back, their story is filled with heartbreaking moments where one honest conversation, one act of courage, one step toward vulnerability might have changed everything. What if Sandra had been able to speak about her childhood trauma early in life? The abuse she endured and the silence that followed shaped her entire emotional world. She grew up believing that survival meant pleasing others, smiling through pain, keeping secrets, never making waves. If she had been able to open up, perhaps she could have begun to heal before fame and marriage magnified those wounds. Maybe she wouldn't have relied so much on external validation from her mother, her audience, or Bobby. Therapy, compassion, and openness might have given her the strength to stand on her own instead of shrinking into persona others demanded of her. And what if Bobby Darin, instead of letting jealousy fester, had confronted his suspicions with honesty? He was a man driven by fear, of failure, of death, of losing control. When he sensed distance, he responded not with communication but with withdrawal or anger. If he had been able to look Sandra in the eye and ask, "What's really going on?" instead of assuming betrayal, they might have found a path back to each other. His decision to use intermediaries, a psychiatrist, a phone call, instead of his own words turned every misunderstanding into a final verdict. A direct conversation could disarm the tension and save the bond they both still cherish beneath the bitterness. Could they have survived with therapy, patience, and humility? Possibly. They were both young when they married. Sandra barely 18, Bobby in his mid-20s. Neither had the emotional tools to navigate fame, insecurity, and love all at once. A modern therapist would see their issues clearly. Childhood trauma meeting deep-seated anxiety, dependency meeting control. But in the 1960s, therapy was taboo, especially for public figures who had to appear perfect. The culture didn't allow them to say, "We need help." Instead, they buried their pain beneath charm and ambition until it broke them. Hollywood itself was another silent accomplice in their downfall. The industry that built them up also demanded their constant performance, not just on screen, but in life. Studio contracts dictated appearances, interviews, photo shoots, even personal relationships. Sandra was marketed as eternal innocent. Bobby was a driven showman. There was no room for real struggle, for imperfection, for being human. Their time apart, his tours, her filming, stretched the fragile threads of their relationship even thinner. Had the industry allowed them to step away, to be private, to heal, maybe they could have found a way back to each other. It's easy to imagine a different ending. Sandra, older and more self-assured, standing beside Bobby not as a sweetheart, but as an equal. Bobby, learning to trust, letting go of the need to control. Perhaps they could build a quieter, more honest love, one free of tabloid pressure and youthful fear. Maybe they would have raised their son together, collaborated again in films or music, grown old side by side. But life doesn't give do-overs. Their story, in the end, stands as both a tragedy and a lesson, a reminder of how love can falter when pain goes unspoken, and how easily two people can lose each other not through betrayal, but through silence. Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin were, in many ways, victims of their time. Two fragile hearts caught in the machinery of fame, expectation, and fear. And while we can't rewrite their past, we can reflect on its meaning, that honesty, vulnerability, and self-understanding are the only true foundations of lasting love. The story of Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin is more than a Hollywood tragedy. It's a mirror reflecting the quiet, universal truths about love, insecurity, and human frailty. Their downfall wasn't written by the tabloids or shaped by scandal. It was born in the small, private moments where love faltered under the weight of silence, fear, and misunderstanding. From their story come lessons that stretch far beyond fame. Lessons about what happens when jealousy replaces trust, when trauma goes unhealed, and when communication breaks down in the spaces where it's needed most. The first and most painful truth is the danger of jealousy left to fester. In any relationship, suspicion can be like a slow-moving poison. Bobby Darin's jealousy began as a flicker of insecurity, a natural reaction to a wife adored by millions. But instead of confronting it, he fed it. Every laugh Sandra shared, every conversation with another man became a threat. Over time, that jealousy stopped being about her at all. It became about him. His fear of being unworthy, of losing control. The more he doubted, the more distance he created, until the love that once brought them together became a battlefield of mistrust. Their marriage reminds us that jealousy doesn't protect love. It erodes one suspicion at a time. Communication, too, was a casualty in their story. Bobby's habit of expressing anger through intermediaries, messages passed by friends, managers, or even psychiatrists, turned misunderstandings into wounds that never healed. Sandra's silence, born from years of being told to smile and obey, only deepened the chasm. It's a timeless lesson. Love cannot survive through silence or second-hand words. Speaking directly, even when it hurts, is the only way to preserve trust, because the moment you start letting others speak for your heart, you begin to lose control of the truth. Then there's a shadow of trauma, the invisible force that shaped Sandra Dee's entire life. The abuse she suffered in childhood didn't just leave scars. It rewired her understanding of love and safety. Without healing, she carried those wounds into every adult relationship. Her need for approval, her fear of confrontation, her desperate attempts to hold on to affection, all were echoes of the little girl who had learned to endure pain quietly. Her story shows that unhealed trauma doesn't disappear. It simply hides, surfacing later in the ways we love, react, and trust. Healing those wounds isn't weakness. It's the only way to break the cycle. Their marriage also reveals the crushing cost of celebrity love. In the glare of fame, even the smallest conflict becomes public spectacle. The pressure to appear perfect, the smiling photos, the staged interviews, the America's sweetheart image left no room for vulnerability. They weren't allowed to be flawed humans. They had to be icons. And when the curtain fell, neither knew how to live outside the script that Hollywood had written for them. Their love became a performance they could no longer sustain. Finally, their lives offer a sobering truth. Perfection in public rarely means peace in private. Sandra Dee was adored by millions, envied by countless women, and admired by men worldwide. Yet behind her beauty and fame was a woman drowning in loneliness, self-doubt, and quiet pain. Bobby Darin, outwardly confident and magnetic, was driven by fear of time, of death, of losing control. Together, they looked flawless, but their hearts were fractured long before the world ever saw the cracks. In the end, their story isn't just a cautionary tale about Hollywood. It's a reflection of what happens when love meets insecurity, when image replaces intimacy, and when the need to appear perfect becomes stronger than the need to be honest. Sandra and Bobby's marriage may have ended decades ago, but its lessons endure. Talk before you accuse, heal before you love, and never mistake the spotlight for light within. Because even the brightest stars can burn out when the warmth between them fades. Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin's story began as one of Hollywood's brightest love tales, a whirlwind romance between two young stars whose chemistry lit up the screen and charmed the world. They had it all: fame, beauty, talent, and a seemingly perfect marriage that embodied the glamour of their era. But beneath the lights and applause, their love was slowly being undone by forces neither of them fully understood. What began in passion and promise ended in heartbreak, not with one shocking betrayal, but with a quiet, relentless erosion of trust shaped by jealousy, fear, and wounds carried from the past. The affair that destroyed the marriage was never truly an affair at all. It was a symptom of unspoken pain, of emotional distance, of two people unable to bridge the silence that grew between them. Sandra's childhood trauma, buried for years beneath her perfect smile, met Bobby's deep insecurities and need for control. Together, they created a love that was both tender and combustible. Each misunderstanding deepened the divide, until what had once been unbreakable love turned into quiet suffering. By the time their marriage ended, both were left scarred. Bobby's jealousy had cost him the woman he once worshipped, and Sandra's silence had trapped her in a cycle of shame and isolation. Yet even in separation, a lingering affection remained, a connection that neither fame nor time could erase. Their son, Bobby Darin, later wrote that his parents were two broken souls who truly loved each other but didn't know how to make it work. That is perhaps the truest legacy of Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin. A reminder that behind every Hollywood love story are real people, fragile, flawed, and yearning to be understood. The spotlight can make love look perfect, but it can't protect it from the pain that lives in the shadows.